Fascinating and, let's be honest, at times, pretty unsettling exploration.
Mhm.
We're going to dive deep into how our foundational societal systems, and we're putting a particular focus on education here, might be shaping not just what we learn, but critically how we think, how we react, and how we participate in our world.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We'll be pulling insights from a really rich collection of sources today, things like expert analyses of political and economic shifts, educational philosophy, some classic psychological experiments, and even some pretty intriguing theories about knowledge control.
Indeed. And our mission today really is to thoroughly unpack the complex interplay between these historical educational models, the very potent psychological concept of learned helplessness.
Which we'll definitely get into.
Oh, yeah. And then there's the intriguing invisible college theory of knowledge and maybe even belief control, and how all of that connects to the contemporary political landscape. We'll examine how these seemingly, disparate elements might actually align to explain some of the most significant challenges facing our society,
Mm,
particularly regarding our children and those deemed most vulnerable.
right.
And we'll also consider what this convergence could mean for our collective future
Yeah.
and maybe what overall goal these systems seem to be driving towards. It raises some tough questions.
It really does. We've got a lot to cover, everything from the deep roots of the American public school system to, well, modern-day government actions and their far-reaching, perhaps even insidious consequences. So buckle up, because we're about to delve into some truly thought-provoking territory that might just reframe how you see the world around you.
Okay, so let's start by looking back. Let's look at the very blueprint of our education system. When you think about school, I mean, most of us probably conjure images of discovery, right? Personal
Yeah,
growth, maybe even fostering creativity.
sure, that's the ideal.
But our sources reveal a much more complex and frankly less idealistic origin story. It seems the system wasn't initially designed for individual enlightenment at all. No, not really. And what's truly striking, I think, that emerges from our sources is how the American public education system, the very bedrock of our society, traces its roots directly back to the 19th century Prussian model.
The Prussian model. Okay, tell us about that.
Well, this wasn't a system conceived for nurturing independent thought or, individual flourishing. Quite the opposite, actually. Its explicit goal was to instill duty, discipline, respect for authority, and the ability to follow orders.
Duty, discipline, respect, follow orders.
Right.
Sounds militaristic.
It has those undertones, definitely. The aim was to create social obedience and loyalty to the crown, and quite practically, train individuals for the military and the bureaucracy. It was about state needs, not individual potential.
So if it wasn't about nurturing independent thought, it was essentially about creating compliant citizens and soldiers, almost like a command and control structure for society.
Precisely. And this Prussian model didn't just emerge out of nowhere. It was a direct response to a profound national crisis for them. Prussia had suffered just a crushing defeat by Napoleon back in 1806.
Right.
And their military leaders concluded that a key weakness was that their soldiers were, quote, thinking for themselves on the battlefield. They saw that as a problem.
Thinking for themselves was a problem. Wow.
Yeah. So the new educational system was designed specifically to eliminate that, to produce a predictable, controllable populace right from childhood. And the philosophical underpinnings of this are quite stark, even chilling when you read them.
How so?
Well, one key influence was the philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte. His vision for schools was, and this is a direct quote, to fashion the person in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will.
Cannot will otherwise. That sounds intense.
It is. It wasn't just about discipline. It was about fundamentally reprogramming the very core of a person's independent will, almost like a societal mind control experiment playing out in classrooms, as you put it earlier.
So it wasn't just about discipline, but about fundamentally reprogramming the very core of a person's independent will, almost like a societal mind control experiment playing out in our classrooms.
In essence, yes, that's precisely what our sources suggest Fichte was aiming for. He explicitly aimed to destroy free will
Destroy free will.
and make pupils incapable throughout their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. I mean, it's incredibly direct.
Wow.
Our sources highlight that this system was quite literally engineered to squeeze out all independent thinking from the masses
Squeeze it out.
and to remove the power of most people to make sense out of the available information.
Yeah.
So in this model, critical thinking wasn't just neglected, it was intentionally done away with.
Done away with. Okay, so this system, designed for conformity, control, how did it end up here in the U.S.?
Well, it was introduced to the U.S. by influential figures like Horace Mann, who saw it as a way to achieve social order and efficiency. And it spread very, very quickly across the states, becoming the foundation of what we now recognize as public schooling.
So the system was built for conformity, not just for military needs, but for broader societal control, almost to create a specific kind of person. And this factory model idea, it seems perfectly suited for a rapidly industrializing nation, doesn't it?
You're absolutely right. The timing was no coincidence at all. Concurrently with the surge of industrialization in America, the educational system was indeed redesigned, or perhaps adapted, to make good factory workers.
Make good factory workers. Not good thinkers, but good workers.
Exactly. The founders of the American public school system were quite open about their intentions. Their goal was explicitly to create more efficient workers, molding individuals into, and this phrase comes up again, interchangeable cogs.
Interchangeable cogs.
People who would reliably show up for their shift at the factory where they do their one task on repeat, day in, day out.
Wow. And deviation wasn't tolerated.
No. Our sources indicate that any deviation from this factory norm was actively punished. You needed discipline, punctuality, the ability to follow instructions without question. This historical purpose aligns perfectly with the idea of producing obedient and conformist individuals, stripped of independent thought, really just serving the needs of a burgeoning industrial economy.
And yet, children are naturally bursting with creativity. Sir Ken Robinson famously asked, do schools kill creativity? What does our material tell us about that, especially when you juxtapose it against this rigid, conformity-focused system?
Yeah, that's a huge tension, isn't it? This raises an important question about the stark contrast between this rigid system and children's natural capacities. Children, as our sources emphasize, are born with tremendous talents and extraordinary capacities for innovation.
They really are.
They're inherently curious, they take chances, and importantly, they aren't frightened of being wrong. Not initially, anyway.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure, think of the story Sir Ken Robinson told about the little girl drawing God. The teacher says, "But nobody knows what God looks like." And the girl confidently replies, "They will in a minute."
I love that.
Or another one, the 4-year-old in the nativity play. The wise men arrive, bearing gifts gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But this little boy, playing one of the wise men, confidently announced, "Frank sent us."
Frank sent this. That's brilliant.
It really is. These delightful anecdotes illustrate children's fearlessness in the face of uncertainty and their uninhibited imaginative approach to new ideas. They haven't learned to be embarrassed by being wrong yet.
Those stories really paint a picture, don't they? I think many of us can look back at our own childhoods and remember that fearless creativity, perhaps before the world started teaching us to stay within the lines literally and figuratively.
Exactly. But the unfortunate reality, as our sources point out, and as Ken Robinson argued so powerfully, is that by adulthood, most people lose this capacity. They become frightened of being wrong.
Why? What happens?
Well, the argument is that it's largely because our national education systems actively stigmatize mistakes. Mistakes are seen as failures, things to be avoided at all costs, rather than, essential opportunities for learning and growth.
Yeah, red marks on a page.
Right. Picasso's observation that all children are born artists, the problem is to remain an artist as we grow up, rings profoundly true here. Education, in this sense, often educates people out of their creative capacities.
Educates them out of it.
Yeah. The system prioritizes academic ability, particularly certain types, and standardization. It often pushes arts and humanities, where that kind of creative exploration thrives, to the lowest status. So it actively works against nurturing that innate innovative spark.
And the outcome.
The outcome is often that highly talented, brilliant, creative people grow up thinking they are not talented or creative simply because their unique strengths weren't valued or even recognized within the confines of this factory norm. They didn't fit the mold.
It sounds like a deliberate trade-off, then. Prioritizing certain societal goals like industrial efficiency or social control over individual flourishing and creativity. But I'm curious, is there a point where some degree of standardization or discipline becomes beneficial for a functional society? Where do our sources draw that crucial line between necessary structure and the active suppression of creativity?
That's a crucial distinction. And our sources suggest the problem really arises when the balance tips entirely towards suppression, towards conformity above all else. The systems were perpetuated, yes, due to historical needs, perceived needs, anyway, for social control, industrial efficiency, national cohesion, and ultimately power for those in charge.
Okay.
Even if they suppressed individual creativity, the overarching goal was national strength and prosperity, achieved through a disciplined workforce and a capable, albeit, narrowly focused elite.
And there was the whole issue of immigration too, right?
Yeah.
Assimilation.
Absolutely. The American public education system was also explicitly designed to assimilate mass immigration and integrate vastly different regional cultures within America into a cohesive national identity, create a unified American.
Right.
And then the perceived needs of both industrialization and the world wars further encouraged the development of a docile and easily managed populace. This collectively led to an educational system that, as our sources state, prized conformity, docility, systematizing, measuring, and math or science against the humanities.
So it wasn't just factory workers in the literal industrial sense anymore. It shifted perhaps to producing compliant, docile bodies who would just do what's told, get a home, go to school, work, buy stuff, live the American way without really questioning the underlying system.
That seems to be the argument presented in the sources, yes. It evolved. The goal remained conformity and obedience, just adapted to new societal structures. The problem is that this system, as someone like Stafford Beer reportedly observed regarding the Austrian factory method of education, often produces, let's just say, less than ideal outcomes, people who are maybe not equipped for critical thinking.
Shitty people who don't know shit from shinola was the quote, I believe.
Something like that, yes, leading to a repetition of uncritical patterns across generations. And the ultimate outcome, as our sources describe it, is a profound dumbing down of society, widespread cultural illiteracy, and generations that are progressively less knowledgeable in crucial ways.
And that leads to this description of younger individuals as zombie-like NPCs. That's a harsh term.
It is harsh, but it reflects a concern in the sources about a perceived lack of individual agency or personality, describing people lacking personal opinions, hobbies, drive, direction, personality, just sort of going through the motions.
Wow. That description of zombie-like NPCs lacking drive and personality is particularly stark. It immediately brings to mind the psychological phenomenon of learned helplessness. So if our foundational education system was engineered to diminish independent thought and creativity, it begs a crucial question. How does this historical conditioning then translate into a population's present-day reactions to challenges, especially when faced with overwhelming odds or confusing information? Okay, so we established how our education system was, at its core, fundamentally designed to create a compliant workforce and citizenry, not exactly encouraging rebels and innovators.
No, quite the opposite.
Now, let's explore a psychological concept that helps explain how this conditioning might actually operate and manifest in our daily lives. Learned helplessness. This seems absolutely crucial to understanding how a population can become so passive, so accepting of their circumstances, even when those circumstances...
Aspect that emerges from the research, particularly highlighted in our sources, is just how quickly learned helplessness can be induced in people.
Quickly. How quickly?
Well, our sources describe a particularly vivid experiment using anagrams that illustrates this phenomenon with startling clarity. It doesn't take long at all.
Okay, tell us about it. I'm intrigued by how something seemingly simple, like a word puzzle, could have such profound psychological effects on human behavior and maybe predict wider societal trends.
Right. So in this experiment, participants were divided into two groups in a room. One side received a list of genuinely easy anagrams, simple words like bat or melon, which they could solve quickly. This naturally fostered a sense of accomplishment, competence.
Okay, easy wins, confidence boost.
Yeah, exactly. The other side, however, received a list of unsolvable anagrams for their first two words. These puzzles were literally impossible to crack. They were designed to be frustrating.
Unsolvable. Okay, that's setting them up.
Totally.
Yeah.
And crucially, after this initial phase, both sides were then given the same perfectly solvable third word. The word was cinerama, which, when unscrambled, spells American.
American.
Yeah.
Okay, so one group is feeling good, the other is feeling probably pretty dumb and frustrated.
You got it. I can only imagine the frustration for the group struggling with the impossible puzzles. It sounds like a setup for a very specific emotional response. It absolutely was. The side, given the unsolvable first two words, quickly reported feeling stupid, rushed, confused, and intensely frustrated.
I bet, especially seeing the other side succeed.
Right. They could see the other side easily solving their puzzles, which only amplified their sense of inadequacy and failure. So by the time they reached that third word, cinerama, their confidence was shot.
Even though it was solvable.
Even though it was objectively easy and identical to the one the other group solved effortlessly, they had a significantly harder time solving it. Many of them just gave up. This clearly demonstrated that just 5 minutes of feeling a complete lack of control, of being unable to influence an outcome, was enough to induce learned helplessness. 5 minutes.
That experiment vividly shows how quickly helplessness can be induced. It's quite frightening. But I wonder, is there a risk of overstating the individual's susceptibility? Do our sources suggest any inherent human resilience that can push back against such conditioning? Or are we just wired to give up easily?
That's a vital question about resilience. And while the sources definitely highlight our susceptibility, they also implicitly suggest that awareness is the first step in countering it. Understanding the mechanism helps you recognize it in yourself and others. But regarding the broader application,
Yeah, how does this translate beyond puzzles?
well, this experiment illustrates that when people feel a lack of agency, their confidence plummets and they just stop trying, even when solutions are available or when circumstances change. This isn't just about puzzles, it's learned helplessness writ large across society.
Mm.
The concept extends powerfully to social relationships and cultural norms. Our sources mention, for example, that if someone is victimized once, they are statistically less likely to stand up for themselves the next time. It conditions a passive response.
Right.
And cultural pressures can play a huge role too, like girls being pressured to be quiet and not to be angry. This can further entrench this passive behavior, making them less likely to use their voices even when facing clear injustice.
So this isn't just about individual psychology, but how societal norms and repeated negative experiences can cumulatively erode a group's agency and perpetuate a sense of powerlessness. It becomes a feedback loop.
Absolutely. A vicious cycle, really. And this historical conditioning we discussed earlier, the education system designed to cultivate obedience and conformity, is perpetuated by modern educational shortcomings that continue to educate people out of their creative capacities and make them frightened of being wrong.
So the schools are still contributing to this.
According to these sources, yes. This results in that dumbing down and cultural illiteracy we talked about, producing the zombie-like NPCs, individuals lacking personal opinions, hobbies, drive, direction, personality. These characteristics align directly with learned helplessness.
It's a perfect match.
It really is. So when these individuals are confronted with complex political or economic challenges, things that feel overwhelming, confusing, they're much more likely to feel stupid, confused, and frustrated. And what do?
They shut down?
They close down. They stop trying to understand or influence outcomes.
Yeah.
This creates a populace whose confidence was shot, who are culturally pressured to be quiet, making them far less likely to challenge authority or engage in collective resistance. This is how learned helplessness, according to our sources, explains and predicts what's going on now and what might be becoming a populace increasingly passive, accepting their circumstances, even when those circumstances are demonstrably harmful.
And the political implications of a populace conditioned this way are, well, they're immense, aren't they? It sounds like an ideal environment for consolidating power and perhaps ensuring only one party remains in charge, or that elections become meaningless.
Immense is an understatement. An uncritical, compliant, and passive populace is, frankly, essential fuel for an authoritarian state. It's what allows it to function.
How so?
As our sources starkly state, illegitimate governments don't want an educated populace, because if you do not have an educated populace, you could say the world is flat, and there is no one to challenge what you are saying. It's that simple.
Ignorance is strength, in their view.
Essentially. This makes citizens highly susceptible to leaders who promise easy answers, who pledge to take control and bring about order, especially during times of confusion or crisis. And it makes them much less likely to question the dismantling of democratic norms, especially if they already believe deep down that nothing works and feel powerless to change anything anyway.
So this psychological conditioning, combined with a lack of critical thinking skills fostered by the education system, creates a society primed for manipulation and control. It paves the way for a single party or a single leader to dominate without significant challenge or opposition because a population has learned to be helpless.
That's the core argument presented in the sources, yes.
Yeah.
A chillingly effective synergy.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork. We've got the historical context of an education system designed for obedience, not critical thought. We've got the psychological impact of learned helplessness, making people passive and less likely to challenge things.
Right, the pieces are fitting together.
Now, let's turn to how these foundational elements intersect with current government actions. Specifically, looking at how certain behaviors, according to our sources, could be reshaping democratic processes and actively consolidating power. It seems like a deliberate strategy to dismantle the very checks and balances of a functioning democracy, possibly even to prevent future elections from genuinely challenging power.
Yeah, if we connect this learned helplessness and educational background to the bigger political picture, our sources describe a clear and, frankly, systematic pattern of actions. Actions aimed squarely at attacking the foundations of democratic governance and consolidating power in the executive branch, making it incredibly difficult for opposing voices to gain ground or for fair elections to even occur in a meaningful way.
So this isn't just about winning an election anymore, but about fundamentally altering the rules of the game itself, making sure future challenges are impossible.
That appears to be the strategy outlined, yes.
Yeah.
It goes beyond campaigning. It's about structuring the system for permanent advantage.
How does this begin to manifest? Where do we see it first?
Well, one major facet identified is the deliberate undermining of electoral legitimacy and public trust. That's fundamental. Our sources highlight how the administration has openly suggested and questioned whether the ballot box could be trusted because previous elections had been rigged.
The rigged election narrative.
Exactly. This isn't merely political commentary. This rhetoric directly erodes public faith in the entire electoral process. It creates a convenient justification for rejecting future election outcomes if they're unfavorable, or for implementing more restrictive, potentially undemocratic, voting measures designed to suppress opposition votes,
So it primes the population to accept losing democracy.
or to accept measures that look like they're ensuring integrity but are actually disenfranchising people. Furthermore, the political rhetoric described in our sources consistently positions us versus them in existential terms.
Us versus them. Existential.
Yeah, labeling opponents, for instance, calling them the radical left or enemies of the state, frames them not just as political adversaries, but as the root problem, an existential threat. Some sources even point to rhetoric that seems to valorize violence in political discourse.
Valorizing violence. That's dangerous.
Extremely. It fuels a deeply polarized environment where electoral defeat isn't seen as a normal democratic transition, but as an existential threat to one's way of life or even the nation itself. This can potentially lead to the rejection of peaceful transfers of power and foster rising political violence, even explicit calls for things like civil war, which we've seen hints of.
That's a dangerous path, fostering division and distrust in the very mechanisms of democracy. What about consolidating executive power directly and suppressing dissent? Our sources suggest a move towards a more centralized and authoritarian model beyond just rhetoric.
Indeed, the sources paint a pretty stark picture here. There are documented efforts described as building a personal paramilitary force.
Personal paramilitary force, what does that mean?
It refers to composing federal police agencies considered most loyal to him, the
Yeah.
leader. ICE, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, is often cited as an example here. Our sources note that ICE's budget was significantly increased, even tripled according to some reports, potentially to facilitate this expansion and its deployment domestically. The concern is that these forces are intended to answer only to him, directly to the executive, and put him in total control, explicitly bypassing traditional chains of command and the checks on executive power that are fundamental to democratic governance.
So, loyalty to the person over loyalty to the Constitution or the law.
That's the implication. It's a direct challenge to the idea of independent law enforcement serving the public rather than a single individual's political agenda.
And this extends to military involvement in domestic affairs. That's something traditionally avoided in a democracy, right? To prevent the appearance of a martial state.
Precisely. And yet we're seeing what our sources describe as a concerning militarization of domestic law enforcement. Armed U.S. troops, including units of the National Guard, and even, in some instances, Marines, have been deployed to American cities over the objection of local mayors or governors.
Over local objections.
Yes, often in response to what our sources describe as manufactured crises or situations where local authorities felt they had things under control. The rationale given for these deployments, sometimes articulated quite openly like Christine Noem's stated intent to liberate this city from its socialist leadership, indicates a desire to override local democratic governance and impose federal control.
Liberate a city from its elected leaders.
That's the language used. It fundamentally blurs the lines between military action and domestic law enforcement, a separation historically maintained very carefully in democracies, specifically to safeguard civil liberties and prevent authoritarian creep.
Beyond force, what about the legal system itself? Are there actions described that undermine due process and legal protections, especially for vulnerable populations that could solidify this shift in power?
Right.
Make people afraid to even seek justice?
Unfortunately, yes. According to our sources, there's been a pattern described as the evisceration of due process. This includes actively targeting lawyers who provide legal aid to immigrants.
Targeting lawyers.
Well, there's a specific instance mentioned of a lawyer whose Wi-Fi was allegedly cut during a visit from unnamed agents, who then subsequently lost his job. Whether directly connected or not, it creates a chilling effect.
Definitely.
The sources also mention a push for massive new detention centers where access to legal representation is deliberately made difficult, if not impossible. And furthermore, a Supreme Court ruling is cited, which allows stops and potentially abductions based primarily on ethnicity or accent near borders, which critics argue further legalizes arbitrary state power and racial profiling.
So it makes certain groups incredibly vulnerable with fewer legal recourses.
Exactly. These actions directly target vulnerable populations, stripping them of fundamental rights. And in doing so, they weaken the rule of law and due process for everyone, creating an environment of fear and a chilling effect on anyone who might challenge authority. Because if it can happen to them, it can happen to you.
And within the government itself, it seems like there's a move described to ensure loyalty above all else, rather than professional expertise or adherence to democratic norms, a sort of internal cleansing.
That's right. There have been concerted efforts, as detailed in our sources, to purge federal agencies of institutionalists,
Constitutionalists.
meaning career professionals, individuals whose primary loyalty is to their department, its mission, the law, and the Constitution, rather than a specific political leader. They're being replaced, the sources say, with individuals whose primary loyalty was to Trump.
So loyalty tests, essentially.
It appears that way. This includes documented instances of removing high-ranking generals and legal counsel who opposed requests to deploy the military against domestic protests, for example.
Yeah.
People who pushed back based on legal or constitutional grounds.
Right.
This ensures that key state institutions are staffed by loyalists rather than independent professionals, further solidifying a one-party-like control over the machinery of government and dismantling the internal checks and balances designed specifically to prevent abuse of power.
So what we're seeing described here isn't just about policy changes. It's a systematic approach to altering the very structure of governance, weakening checks and balances, installing loyalists, and even asserting federal control at the local level, all designed to prevent opposition from gaining ground or effectively challenging power. How have communities actually responded to these deployments, particularly when they were implemented without local consent, like in Memphis?
Well, the responses from local leaders, as detailed in the sources, have been varied but often quite resistant. They clearly demonstrate a struggle against this perceived federal overreach and an attempt to defend local autonomy. The Memphis example is quite telling.
What happened there?
Mayor Paul Young explicitly stated that he did not ask for the National Guard and, quote, does not want them there. He didn't just state his preference, he backed it up with data.
Data.
Yeah, he highlighted compelling statistics showing that crime was already significantly down in Memphis before any federal intervention, like 13% overall crime reduction, 19% down in violent crime, and a remarkable 29% reduction in murders in 2024.
So the crisis narrative didn't match the facts on the ground.
Exactly. His data directly pushed back on the administration's notion that federal intervention was necessary or even beneficial. He was essentially saying, we've got this handled, your presence isn't needed and isn't welcome.
It sounds like local leaders are trying to assert their authority and highlight the reality on the ground, countering a narrative of crisis perhaps being used to justify intervention.
Absolutely. And further reinforcing this local opposition, Tennessee Congressman Steve Cohen and State Senator London Lamar publicly called the deployment an unnecessary stunt and a Trump show designed purely to display power, not solve a problem.
A political stunt.
That's how they framed it. They argued strongly against a militarized police force replacing civilian policing. Instead, they advocated for investing in proven crime prevention grants, which, ironically, the Trump administration had actually cut in supporting local community-based strategies rather than top-down militarization.
So the feds cut funding for local solutions, then send in troops over local objections.
That's the picture painted by the sources in this instance. It illustrates how federal actions sometimes disregard local conditions and expertise, potentially overriding the democratic will of the community to assert federal authority. However, it gets complex.
How so?
While the Memphis mayor strongly opposed the deployment, the Tennessee governor, Bill Lee, who is a Republican, actually welcomed the troops.
So state versus local conflict.
Exactly. This highlights the complex political dynamics where state and federal leaders of the same party might align against local objections, often from leaders of a different party, further complicating democratic processes and local autonomy, making it even harder for communities to resist the consolidation of power from above.
And these actions, this pattern of control and intervention, aren't just limited to law enforcement, are they? They extend to critical public services, specifically public education, which is where we started this whole deep dive. This seems like a direct attack on the ability of future generations to engage critically with democracy, potentially to further down the line.
Correct. Our sources explicitly describe an intentional destruction of public education. That's strong language.
Intentional destruction.
Through sweeping cuts to funding and the targeted elimination of critical programs. This isn't presented as just belt-tightening. It's framed as part of a larger plan of gutting the government and, crucially, breaking public trust.
Breaking public trust in government services, why?
The stated goal, according to these analyses, is strategic. It aims to make citizens believe that nothing works, that government is inherently incompetent. This leads them, over time, to start to forget what a functioning democracy is supposed to do.
So they lower their expectations and maybe become more willing to accept authoritarian solutions.
Precisely. The consequence is a diminishing of their will and their capacity to defend democratic institutions because they don't even remember what those institutions are supposed to deliver. It's a systematic weakening of the very system designed to foster critical thought and an informed citizenry, making it easier for an illegitimate government, as the sources put it, to control narratives and maintain power without effective challenge.
This sounds like a strategic move to create a less informed, more compliant populace, tying directly back to the learned helplessness we discussed earlier. If you believe nothing works and you can't change it, you become easier to control.
Indeed. And it goes beyond education. Our sources also detail plans for sweeping cuts to healthcare funding across the country, specifically targeting federal Medicaid spending with cuts projected around $1 trillion.
$1 trillion from Medicaid. The impact must be huge.
Devastating for many. This impacts states heavily, forcing them into tough choices about which programs to cut or curtail. Projections suggest this could lead to potentially 7 million more uninsured people, rising premiums even for those with private insurance as hospitals shift costs, and increased uncompensated care burdens for hospitals, potentially leading to closures, especially in rural areas.
So weakening the social safety net makes people more desperate, more vulnerable.
Yes. And furthermore, the cuts to education funding aren't just general. They specifically target programs like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs designed to support English as second language learners, LGBTQ+ students, and other vulnerable children. They also threaten Head Start programs, which disproportionately benefit low-income communities.
So the cuts are targeted at groups that might already feel marginalized or helpless?
It appears so. These actions not only target vulnerable populations, exacerbating their helplessness and reducing their opportunities, but also systematically weaken public services that could alleviate poverty and empower individuals. This leaves people more dependent, more focused on basic survival, and less capable of challenging authority or participating effectively in democracy.
It really sounds like a multi-pronged strategy then. Undermine elections, centralize power, use force or the threat of it, erode legal protections, install loyalists, and gut public services like education and healthcare, all designed to weaken public institutions and trust while making vulnerable populations even more susceptible to control, almost guaranteeing that only one voice, one party can truly be heard or hold power. Okay, so beyond the visible actions of government, the policies, the deployments, the cuts, our sources introduce another, perhaps even more unsettling layer of influence, this concept of the invisible college. This isn't just about government secrecy or classified information, is it? It hints at something more profound, a shaping of our understanding, our very belief systems, maybe even reality itself. This sounds like the ultimate form of control over a compliant populace, not just controlling their actions, but shaping what they can even conceive of as true or possible.
That's exactly the unsettling implication. Delving deeper, one truly striking aspect is how the concept of an invisible network pursuing knowledge, which sounded benign enough initially, carries, as one source puts it, a far more unsettling connotation. One deeply rooted in the manipulation of understanding, maybe reality itself.
Manipulation of reality itself, how?
Well, it suggests that powerful, often unseen forces, or maybe even hidden intelligences, might be actively shaping human belief and perception on a mass scale. Think of it less as a simple conspiracy theory with guys in smoke-filled rooms, and more like a subtle, pervasive current in the waters of public consciousness.
Like an undercurrent.
Yeah, guiding the ships of our thoughts without us even noticing the steering hand. It's a step beyond simply withholding information. It implies an active curation of what people are allowed to think about, or even what they experience as reality. It's about defining the boundaries of the believable.
So it's like a deeper, more subtle form of influence, perhaps even psychological manipulation on a grand scale, operating beneath the surface of everyday life, setting the agenda for what's considered normal or possible.
Exactly. And historically, our sources point to intriguing links with groups like Rosicrucianism. They're described as a secret brotherhood, pursuing universal reformation through esoteric knowledge. Now, whether you take that literally or metaphorically,
Right.
it hints at this idea of a deeper, more covert guiding hand, almost as if there's a subtle, pervasive influence subtly shaping our perception of the world. This connects directly to the idea that powerful groups might be actively shaping what we believe to be true, and perhaps in a very real sense, making it in our heads.
Making reality in our heads, that's a big concept.
It is. Thinkers like Hermann Hesse are quoted suggesting that serious contemplation of non-existent things can bring them a step closer to existence. And neuroscientist John C. Lilly stated quite directly, what one believes to be true either is true or becomes true within certain limits.
Wow. So belief creates reality to some extent.
Lilly's idea implies a profound, almost co-creative interaction with reality that is actively shaped or made in our heads. Our beliefs filter our perceptions and can influence our actions, which in turn shape the world around us, if someone or something can influence those core beliefs.
They can influence our reality. Okay, that's truly unsettling. And our sources even link this concept to phenomena like UFOs or UAPs, as they're now generally known. How does something so seemingly outlandish fit into this theory of control and reality shaping?
It's a fascinating and, yes, provocative link explored in some of the material. According to Dr. Jacques Vallée, who is a highly respected longtime theorist in the UAP field, even these phenomena might function as a kind of control system.
Ooh, control system. How?
Designed, he suggests, to alter human belief systems and social structures. He specifically points to the often absurd details in UFO encounters, things that seem nonsensical or contradictory.
Yeah, the high strangeness aspect.
Exactly. Valley argues these might be contrived, intentionally deceiving investigators. The chilling question he poses is, to what end? His theory, that these events are deliberately designed to shape belief.
Shape belief how? By confusing us, overwhelming us.
Perhaps. It implies an external intelligence, or maybe even a human one, using advanced methods, deliberately presenting misleading evidence, or orchestrating specific, bizarre experiences to influence human understanding, to fundamentally reshape our perceived reality, maybe push us in certain evolutionary or social directions. This aligns perfectly with the invisible college theory by suggesting a deliberate, covert manipulation of understanding and belief systems, leveraging the seemingly inexplicable to guide our collective consciousness.
That's a wild thought, the idea that even UAP phenomena could be a control system shaping human belief. So, if even something as seemingly outlandish as UAPs could potentially be orchestrating our perception, how much easier is it for more conventional powers like governments to leverage these invisible college-type strategies to curate our understanding of daily reality? How does this connect to the governmental actions we're seeing today, specifically in terms of controlling the narrative and public understanding?
It connects quite directly, unfortunately. Governments are indeed implicated in the source material as leveraging invisible college-like strategies to control public understanding. And this moves beyond mere secrecy or classification into active manipulation, which, as we discussed, directly reinforces learned helplessness by making people feel confused and unable to trust any information.
So how do they do it? What are the tactics?
Well, our sources detail what they call a clear pattern of stoking the lie. This includes reports, for example, of Air Force police records related to UAP incidents being systematically destroyed every 3 years.
Systematically destroyed. Why?
To erase the historical record, presumably. Furthermore, the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, allegedly withheld 95% of findings from ATIP, which was the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, a major government UAP study program. They kept most of the data hidden, even from relevant oversight.
So active withholding and destruction of information.
Yes. And government statements on sensitive topics, not just UAPs, often misrepresent the full truth. They're carefully worded, using non-denial denials and clever phrasing to deny what they know without technically lying, thereby managing public perception and controlling the narrative without outright falsehoods, but still preventing full transparency and understanding.
This sounds like a deliberate attempt to manage public perception and prevent any challenging truths from emerging, creating a very carefully constructed official version of reality.
It absolutely seems that way. Our sources also describe the existence of something called the aviary, which is apparently a term used for disinformation agents.
Disinformation agents, like spies feeding bad info.
Essentially, yes. People who deliberately feed fake stories to journalists or researchers. The goal here is insidious. It's to make them look like frauds and nut jobs, so you can't trust anybody about anything.
Discredit the messengers.
Exactly. If you discredit independent investigators and journalists, who's left to trust? Only the official sources. The overarching objective is to control the narrative and protect specific, usually governmental or corporate interests by shaping what people are even allowed to think about. It fundamentally corrupts the public's ability to discern truth from fiction.
So it creates confusion, erodes trust in everything, and leaves people susceptible to the official story, reinforcing that learned helplessness.
Precisely. This sophisticated manipulation ensures that critical thinking is stifled. It makes individuals more susceptible to official narratives, regardless of their accuracy, because there seem to be no reliable alternatives. It erodes trust in all information sources, leaving only the official one standing, however shaky its foundations.
And what role does academia, supposedly a bastion of independent thought and discovery, play in this grand scheme of curated reality? Is it part of the solution or part of the problem?
Well, according to some critiques in our sources, even mainstream academia, which is described as a direct legacy of these institutions like the early Prussian model, has succumbed to various forms of corruption that hinder genuine inquiry.
Corruption in academia, how?
The pervasive publish or perish culture is cited, where quantity often trumps quality, and a corrupt peer review process, which is often dependent on authority and naturally favors established viewpoints, can actively stifle groundbreaking interdisciplinary work that challenges the status quo. New ideas have a hard time getting through the gatekeepers.
So it reinforces existing paradigms.
Often, yes. This institutional decay, as one source calls it, creates fertile ground for powerful, often unseen forces to keep influencing and controlling how knowledge is pursued and understood. The focus shifts subtly from genuine discovery towards control and the maintenance of existing power structures and accepted narratives. Add to that academic inflation where degrees proliferate, but their real value diminishes, and qualifications are constantly pushed higher just to get a job, and you get a system where genuine curiosity and critical thinking can be overshadowed by conformity to established paradigms just to get ahead.
So, in essence, the entire system, from early education right through to higher learning and even how information is disseminated, can be seen, according to these sources, as being shaped perhaps deliberately to curate reality, limit thought, and maintain a very specific version of truth.
That's the sobering picture painted, yes. A deliberately curated reality, making it incredibly difficult for individuals to form independent, critically informed opinions and potentially creating a society where people are essentially living within a constructed truth, often unaware of the steering hand guiding their perceptions.
Okay, so these discussions about the education system's design, the psychology of learned helplessness, and even these invisible college theories of reality shaping, they don't exist in a vacuum, do they?
Not at all.
They have profound real-world consequences. They impact our economy, they shape our political rhetoric, and they arguably contribute to a societal dumbing down that exacerbates all these other issues. So, expert, let's connect the dots. How does a system designed for obedience rather than innovation actually affect a modern economy? And how does this impact the everyday lives of people trying to get by?
Right, if we connect all this back to the bigger picture, the economy, politics, daily life and reality, the historical educational system, coupled with these efforts to manipulate public understanding and curb critical thought, has several significant impacts. And they actively contribute to the economic and political challenges facing society today. Let's start with those economic ripple effects, because they're quite significant.
Absolutely. How does a system designed for obedience rather than innovation affect an economy that, at least on the surface, seems to need innovation to thrive? Doesn't that create a contradiction?
It creates a massive contradiction. A system that actively educates people out of their creative capacities and stifles original ideas, as our sources argue ours does, directly hinders innovation and competitiveness on a national scale. It's almost self-sabotage economically.
Is there evidence of that?
Well, our sources note a truly surprising statistic. Some analyses suggest technological innovation has actually been in decline for 150 years, with current growth rates, when properly measured, perhaps similar to the 1600s, despite vastly increased access to higher education. The argument is we're educating more people, but maybe not educating them to think innovatively.
Wow, innovation declining. That's counterintuitive.
It is. And the focus on producing those interchangeable cogs, as in the old factory model, is described as no longer useful in a modern economy, increasingly driven by automation, artificial intelligence, and the gig economy, which require adaptability and creativity.
So the education system is preparing people for jobs that don't exist anymore or are disappearing.
Or preparing them in ways that don't fit the new demands, when even the elites, the sources argue, are trained to act like workers and fill their lives with busy work instead of focusing on big-picture thinking, charisma, and innovative solutions. It inevitably leads to poorly governed societies making spectacularly stupid decisions that actively damage economic progress and adaptability.
So an education system that stifles individual potential actually harms the entire economic engine, making us less competitive globally. And what about those at the bottom of the economic ladder? How do these systems, combined with the governmental actions we discussed earlier, like cutting public services, affect them specifically?
Oh, the effects there are devastating, and they create these deeply entrenched poverty traps that are incredibly hard to escape. The cuts to public education, as we discussed, lead directly to overcrowded, under-resourced schools, fewer educational options, and the elimination of crucial support programs for vulnerable students, particularly in low-income communities. This immediately limits social and economic upward mobility.
So the ladder out of poverty gets kicked away.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
Furthermore, defunding programs like SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which helps millions afford food, directly exacerbates food insecurity. This actively creates situations where a lack of access to quality education and basic necessities like food reinforces economic hardship. It's a double whammy.
And then there's the welfare trap idea.
Right. Our sources describe this persistent welfare trap, where taking a low-wage job, if you can even find one, might disqualify individuals from essential benefits like childcare assistance or housing subsidies. But the job's earnings often don't cover basic living costs plus the cost of working, like transportation.
So they're actually worse off financially if they work.
In some cases, objectively, yes. This structure leaves them worse off than if they remained unemployed and receiving benefits. It effectively discourages effort, discourages work, and perpetuates learned helplessness and dependency on a system that isn't designed to help them escape.
That's a brutal cycle, just traps people. And one of our sources even offers a broader critique of capitalism itself within this context. How does that perspective tie into this engineered compliance and the kind of consumerism we see?
Yeah, one perspective presented in our sources suggests that capitalism itself, particularly in its modern form, can be seen as a social equivalent of cancer.
Whoa, strong words. How so?
The argument is that it endlessly serves its own growth by fetishizing objects, creating artificial needs, and constantly raising expectations for material wealth and status that it ultimately cannot deliver for the vast majority. It creates a perpetual dissatisfaction.
Okay. And how does the education system feed into that?
Well, an education system that strips individuals of their inner worth, their creative drive, their sense of purpose beyond consumption, as the sources argue ours tends to do, might, in this view, feed this insatiable consumerist cycle. People are left feeling worthless without the Ferrari and the cuisine art, as one source puts it, pushing them towards an insatiable desire for material possessions to fill an internal void, to signal status. This further perpetuates the system that exploits their learned helplessness and lack of genuine fulfillment, keeping them on the treadmill.
This paints a grim picture of economic stagnation for many, perpetuated poverty traps, and a society driven by external validation rather than internal worth. How does this then influence political rhetoric and the broader political landscape, especially concerning the rise of authoritarian tendencies we keep touching upon?
The impact on political rhetoric is profound and deeply intertwined with these economic and educational factors. A populace that lacks critical thinking skills, feels economically insecure, and has been, as one source puts it, bred from birth to respect authority above all else and accept it without question.
Easier targets for propaganda.
Much easier. And political leaders who understand this can exploit that lack of knowledge and that sense of helplessness. As our sources explicitly state, illegitimate governments don't want an educated populace because if you do not have an educated populace, you could say the world is flat, and there is no one to challenge what you are saying. This makes society highly vulnerable to authoritarianism, as people are less equipped to discern truth from lies or challenge false narratives pushed by charismatic leaders.
And this seems to fuel the incredibly divisive rhetoric we're seeing today, making it even harder for society to function cohesively or find common ground.
It absolutely does. When political rhetoric consistently positions us versus them in existential terms, framing opponents as enemies, and when violence is subtly or overtly valorized as a legitimate political tool, it directly leads to rising political violence and societal fragmentation. We see this polarization intensifying.
And an uncritical population just absorbs this.
An uncritical populace, especially perhaps younger generations, heavily influenced by social media algorithms that reward outrage, can be easily swayed by divisive rhetoric and even extreme calls for things like civil war. This erosion of critical thinking, actively fostered by the failures of the education system, coupled with the intentional destruction of public education and trust in institutions, it's seen in our sources as part of a larger plan of gutting the government and breaking public trust,
To what end?
so that people start to believe nothing works. They forget, or never learned, what a functioning democracy is supposed to do. This diminishes their will and their capacity to defend democratic institutions when they come under attack. It creates fertile ground for populist leaders who rise by promising to pledge to take control and bring about order, often by challenging democracy itself.
And the sources link this rise in extremism and populism to economics, too.
Directly. They link the growth of political extremism and populism directly to bad economic conditions and declining living standards for large segments of the population, and the resulting large wealth, values, and political gaps that tear society apart. It's a perfect storm.
And this whole cycle of decline and change, particularly in terms of economic and political order, is something investor Ray Dalio discusses as the big cycle, right? This puts our current situation into a much larger historical context, suggesting these aren't just isolated events, but part of a potentially predictable pattern for empires.
Exactly. Ray Dalio's book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, outlines what he argues is a timeless and universal cycle for the rise and fall of empires, a cycle he observes lasts roughly 250 years, give or take.
250 years, okay. And what signals a shift in this cycle?
He identifies three major indicators that usually converge to signal a fundamental shift in this world order. First, countries not having enough money to pay their debts, massive debt burdens.
Check.
Second, significant internal conflicts driven by growing gaps in wealth and values, which manifest as the political populism and intense polarization we just discussed.
Double check.
And third, increasing external conflict, particularly between a rising great power and the currently leading but perhaps declining great power.
Okay, sounds familiar. So these aren't just isolated issues, they're interconnected indicators of a larger historical pattern that signals a potential major change in global power dynamics.
Precisely. They feed off each other. The cycle typically progresses like this, according to Dalio's analysis. You have a period of peace and prosperity, often fueled by innovation, but also excessive borrowing, especially for countries with a reserve currency, like the US dollar. This eventually leads to financial bubbles.
Bubbles always burst.
Right. And this prosperity is rarely distributed evenly, which widens the wealth gap between the haves and the have-nots. The bubble eventually bursts, leading to economic crisis. Governments then resort to widespread money printing to cover debts and stimulate the economy, which often exacerbates inflation and further economic instability.
Okay.
This economic turmoil fuels increased internal conflict, political polarization, social unrest, sometimes escalating towards civil war. This creates a vacuum, an opportunity for the rise of strong populist leaders who challenge the established system and pledge to restore order, often through authoritarian means.
And while this is happening internally,
While the empire is struggling domestically, its relative power diminishes compared to external rivals. This leads to increasing external conflicts, trade wars, proxy wars, eventually potentially direct military conflict, and ultimately culminates in the decline of the old empire and the emergence of a new world order led by the rising power.
So where do we stand in this grand cycle according to Dalio's analysis in our sources? Are we nearing a critical juncture, a tipping point?
Well, our sources indicate that the United States currently exhibits many, if not all, of these classic indicators quite strongly. We have massive debt. The country consistently spends more than it earns and funds this deficit through extensive borrowing and money printing.
Yes.
It is also undeniably experiencing great internal and external conflicts for all the classic reasons. Dalio identifies wealth gaps, value clashes, political polarization internally and rising tensions with powers like China externally.
So the signs are there.
The signs are definitely there. Now, Dahlia notes that the big sell-off in dollars and dollar debt hasn't yet begun on a massive scale, and these internal and external conflicts haven't fully crossed the threshold into overt, large-scale wars. However, the indicators strongly suggest we are deep into a phase where democracy is most challenged internally. In such a volatile environment, a move towards a strong populist leader who will bring order to the chaos is most likely.
And that ties back to learned helplessness.
It aligns perfectly. A populace conditioned to helplessness through education and economic hardship, feeling confused and overwhelmed by complex problems, and distrustful of institutions, becomes far more susceptible to such leaders in times of perceived chaos. They crave strong authority to alleviate their frustrations and provide simple answers, even if it means sacrificing democratic principles.
So a populist condition to helplessness, combined with a weakening economic order and divisive political rhetoric, creates a highly unstable environment, making it ripe for authoritarian shifts, potentially driven by a leader promising order, and maybe leading to a complete reordering of society, as Dahlia's cycle suggests. Okay, we've really navigated a complex web here. We've traced the history of an education system built for obedience, explored the psychology of learned helplessness, looked at current political actions seemingly designed to consolidate power and dismantle checks and balances, and even touched on theories of reality shaving through things like the invisible college.
It's a lot of interconnected pieces.
Huh. It is. And now, let's confront the listener's most chilling hypothesis, the one that seems to emerge naturally from connecting all these threads. The potential for a future where children are deliberately made, quote, stupid, indoctrinated, helpless, and trapped. Raised in environment schools, communities explicitly designed to maintain political control and ensure compliance above all else. It sounds like the logical, if terrifying, conclusion of everything we've discussed. Expert, what do our sources say about this overall goal? Does the evidence point towards this kind of engineered stupor?
I have to say, looking at the convergence of themes in the source material, this hypothesis is strongly supported. It doesn't seem like an accidental byproduct, but rather indicates a deliberate, systemic strategy leveraging a populace already conditioned by its educational background and susceptible to learned helplessness. The sources clearly outline elements that point towards the overall goal you're articulating to create a generation that is compliant, uncritical, and ultimately unable to resist control.
So this isn't just an accidental byproduct of flawed systems, but potentially a deliberate design, a conscious manipulation aimed at future generations.
The sources certainly present arguments that suggest a deliberate strategy. One critical element is ideological indoctrination and control, implemented right from an early age in schools. As we've heard, illegitimate governments don't want an educated populace, because an educated populace asks questions and challenges authority.
Right, ignorance is easier to control.
Exactly. This fuels what the sources describe as ideological indoctrination in schools. Curricula can potentially shift towards specific political or social narratives, sometimes even including controversial practices framed as necessary, like segregating students by race under certain justifications, or teaching specific social issues that are described in some sources as being in direct opposition to the tax-paying public's norms.
Regardless of the specific content, the goal is shaping the mindset.
The ultimate goal, echoing that chilling vision from philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte centuries ago, seems to be raising children to be what the teachers wanted them to be, or rather what the state wants them to be, essentially aiming to destroy their free will to think or act otherwise, ensuring complete mental submission and conformity to the desired ideology.
And this ties directly back to the intentional attack on public education we covered. Gutting the system creates the perfect vacuum for this kind of indoctrination to take hold.
Indeed, the intentional destruction of public education through those sweeping cuts and the defunding of programs isn't just about saving money, according to these analyses. It aims to break public trust in public institutions generally and make people believe nothing works effectively.
So they give up on public solutions.
Yes, and they start to forget what a functioning democracy is supposed to do. By systematically weakening the very system that could foster critical thought and diverse perspectives, future generations are left less equipped to challenge manipulated realities or question authority. They are, quite literally, being conditioned to accept their lot, to accept a lower standard of information and agency.
This also seems to lead to a deliberate fostering of vulnerability and a profound lack of agency, making people feel helpless, especially those already marginalized or at risk.
That's a key and deeply disturbing point raised in the material. Our sources highlight specific actions that directly create a climate of fear and helplessness, especially for vulnerable populations like immigrants or minorities. For instance, that Supreme Court ruling allowing stops and potential abductions based primarily on ethnicity or accent near borders that fundamentally broadens arbitrary state power and makes people constantly afraid.
Living in fear.
Yes, and we've seen reports cited of ICE raids happening at public schools, arresting New York City high schoolers who were dreamers. Undocumented students brought here as children, often knowing no other country, and even students with special needs during school hours. These actions aren't just legal changes on paper, they are psychological weapons. They reinforce learned helplessness on a systemic, highly personal level within the most vulnerable communities, sending a message that nowhere is safe, not even school.
And then there's the scenario you mentioned earlier, the listener's concern about schools implementing a no phones policy during emergencies. That seems to lock this helplessness in completely isolating children precisely when they're most vulnerable.
Precisely. That concern, raised by our sources, about school boards implementing no phones policies during critical emergencies, like an active school shooting, would exacerbate this helplessness to an almost unimaginable degree.
How so?
It connects directly to that profound, primal fear that if a kid gets disappeared by IC or a teacher, meaning taken away, detained, or harmed, you'll never be able to call them or have them call you. In such a scenario, children would be utterly isolated, with no means to communicate with outside help, with their families.
Cut off.
Completely.
Ugh.
This leads to absolute control over information and access by the authorities on site, effectively trapping individuals within the system's control during moments of extreme vulnerability and terror. It's the ultimate expression of control over information and personal connection in a crisis, leaving children utterly helpless and totally reliant on the very institutions that might be failing them, or even actively working against their best interests. It removes their last shred of agency.
That is truly terrifying to contemplate, and all of this, the indoctrination, the fear, the isolation, is ultimately backed up by the threat of force, right? The paramilitary forces we discussed earlier, ensuring compliance through overt power if psychological manipulation isn't enough.
Exactly. That piece is crucial. The administration's documented efforts to build a personal paramilitary force whose primary loyalty was to Trump, not the Constitution, the broader militarization of police forces, and the deployment of federal agents like ICE or the National Guard into communities without local consent. These are all described as tools for imposing control and suppressing any dissent that might arise.
So challenge the system, and you face force.
These forces ensure that any challenges to authority, any attempts to break free from this engineered stupor, are met with overwhelming force rather than dialogue or democratic process. This maintains the desired state of conformity and prevents any meaningful resistance from taking root. So the idea that the overall goal is to make kids stupid, indoctrinated, helpless, and trapped is indeed strongly supported by the convergence of these historical trends, psychological mechanisms, and current governmental strategies outlined in our sources. It paints a chillingly coherent, if deeply disturbing, picture of engineered compliance.
So, the picture that emerges is truly bleak. One of a society where the educational system's historical design, the population's conditioned psychological helplessness, and current political actions all converge. They create a population less capable of critical thought, more susceptible to manipulation, and potentially far more vulnerable to unchecked state power, ensuring conformity and an inability to effectively resist. This has truly been a deep dive into the architecture of control.
What's truly striking here as we wrap up is just how all these different threads, the historical design of our education system going back to Prussia, our psychological susceptibility to learned helplessness demonstrated in those experiments, the subtle and overt forms of information control from the invisible college to government disinformation, and the specific actions of a government seeking to consolidate power, how they all weave together. It forms a coherent, deeply interconnected system.
It's not just one thing, it's the interaction.
It's exactly. It suggests a shaping of our individual and collective reality in ways we may not always perceive. From the deliberate design of schools to instill obedience centuries ago, to the modern-day curation of what we believe to be true, and the systematic dismantling of public institutions and legal protections that could empower us, it all seems to point in a similar direction. It all points towards a carefully orchestrated strategy, intentional or not, that affects every aspect of our lives.
And the implications for you, the listener, are profound. This isn't just some abstract academic theory we've been discussing. It touches on the very fabric of how you learn, how you perceive the world, how you participate in society, and ultimately how you can protect your own agency in the future of democratic processes.
Hmm.
Recognizing these patterns, understanding their historical roots and their current manifestations, is really the critical first step in reclaiming that agency, in refusing to be just a passive recipient of a curated reality.
And this raises an important question for all of us to ponder, doesn't it? What might it actually take to shift from systems apparently designed for obedience and conformity towards ones that truly foster critical thinking, genuine creativity, and individual agency? How do we build resilience against learned helplessness?
Yeah.
And perhaps more immediately, what role do you, as an individual, play in recognizing and navigating these powerful forces shaping our world, especially when it comes to supporting institutions, whether in education, journalism, or community organizing, that actively work to build critical thought and challenge manufactured realities?